You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Ghosts have haunted mythologies across the world for millennia, from Scotland's Green Lady to the Duppies of the Caribbean. Every folklore has tried to explain the mystery of where people go after they die. In her latest book, Ghostlore, Icy Sedgwick collects 50 of these chilling tales from cultures and traditions from across the world, capturing some iconic ghost stories in this incredibly beautiful book that horror fans and mythology enthusiasts will not want to miss. Icy and I discuss several of the intriguing cases from around the world in the book, and I cannot recommend this latest release from Icy highly enough. But before that, of course, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. And you can also click the link in the show notes as usual, and thank you to each and every one of you that continue to support the show with your contributions. Mysteries and Monsters is across most social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for episodes and news. Our exclusive merchandise site is available via TeePublic, and you can click the link for that in the show notes too. Our intro and outro music are performed by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you to Dean Bestall for his wonderful artwork, and the show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys. As long as there has been a movement in the corner of your eye, a strange noise in the dark, or a chilling feeling in your stomach, there have been ghost stories, and in Ghostlore, Icy Sedgwick shares 50 of the very best. On today's episode, the realm of the paranormal awaits us as I extend a long overdue welcome back to Icy Sedgwick. Icy's new book, Ghostlore, is currently scaring the shelves on all good bookstores and looks into 50 phantoms that have haunted history from around the world. It's a beautifully illustrated book, and for me, a perfect guide to ghosts near and far. Icy, welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters.
I can't believe it's been so long, honestly. What happened?
Hey, same for you. You know, these things, it's just one of those things. Sometimes I sit down and I think, oh, I've not had that person on for ages. And then, as I said to you, and I looked and I thought, oh my God, it's been 4 years. Where has the time gone?
Time has no meaning anymore.
It's all been a bit strange. You see, we were still opening and shutting a bit in those halcyon days of forced confinement, especially in the north, it would seem.
I quite enjoyed that, I'm not going to lie, because I'm not really that much of an outdoors kind of... Well, I like the outdoors, I just don't necessarily like socialising with people. Yeah. And to sort of be forced to kind of sit at home with my books and everything. And obviously with me having long COVID now, I'm kind of back in a sort of self-imposed version of that. And it's like, no, I have to stay at home and read. No.
Yeah, well, I share that. It eventually got me, not long after we spoke, actually, I ended up getting it. And I'm probably, the last 6 months, I'm near enough back to where I was health-wise.
Oh, that's good.
So it was a bit strange, really, because I didn't, they didn't suspect I got long COVID, but I knew I just wasn't, because I walk every day, I take the dog out, I walk to work, and I was just absolutely exhausted all the time, even after I'd shaken it. And it's only sort of the last 6 months that I've felt fine and I've lost a bit of weight and things like that. And it's a strange thing, Icy. So I'm glad to hear you're on the road to recovery as well. Well,
I don't like to let things keep us down. That's the problem. I've got too many things I want to do.
Absolutely. Well, exactly. There's not much you're not doing at the minute, my dear.
Yeah, it's really annoying when people are like, oh, how have you been? What have you been up to? And it's like, and then you've kind of got to list everything. And you're just like, I hate being that person. But then at the same time, like, other people have all these lovely, like, social things going on and, like, weddings and babies and engagements and things. And I'm like, I have yet another book coming out. So it all kind of balances itself out.
Absolutely. Well, I think in this day and age, we are able to enjoy ourselves and indulge in the things that matter to us more. I don't think we're as forced to be social butterflies as much as we perhaps used to be 10, 15 years ago, Icy. So it's the introvert's way forward, I feel.
I think I'm more of a social bat.
Well, I think most of us only come out at night these days anyway, Icy. There's a lot less people around. It's far more fun.
And this far north, it gets dark so it's like early on. You think, well, it might as well be night. I go to work in the dark and I come home in the dark. So, it's perfect conditions for a goth like me.
Absolutely. This is indeed our time. We always shining as autumn approaches us. So, as I said in the introduction, since we last spoke, you've released a couple of brilliant books. 2 years ago, you had Rebel Folklore, which was amazing. Another series of 50 characters from around the world. And the latest book, Ghostlore, is kind of following on from that wonderful body of work that you released then. And it just absolutely blew me away, Icy. It's a beautiful book. It's one of the prettiest books I've seen. And I don't mean that in a kind of underhand compliment. It is gorgeous. Even the very fact that when you hold the book up, it's got this beautiful wave texture on it. So on the pages, I love little things like that for a book nerd like me. Really get my juices flowing for some reason. Fabulous.
DK do excellent books, mind. And I know obviously I absolutely love how Rebel Folklore came out, obviously, in terms of looks. And I think Melissa, who did the illustrations for that one, like really nailed what each of the figures looked like. And then Mabel, who did this one, you get the feeling she's really enjoyed drawing them as well. Like there's a real sort of sense of, even though some of them are like the Ifrit and they're terrifying, there's almost like a playfulness to some of them, I think, which is really cool. But yeah, when I saw like the end papers, is it end paper? It is end papers, yeah. The end papers, and then like the sprayed edges, and I was like, oh my god, that is so cool. So yeah, it is a nicely illustrated book, and I think one of the things I always find really funny is when people tell me how nice it looks, and I'm like, I didn't draw the pictures, I did the wordy bit. So it's always like, it's nice when people have actually read it as well, because otherwise I'm like, yeah, it is really pretty. And
well, yeah, as you mentioned, Mabel Esteban Garcia is an incredible illustrator, and I'm aware of her previous work as well. I think she's done a couple of comics in the past. Phenomenal artist.
Yeah, she's really nice as well. Not that sort of should make any difference, but she's really nice. But yeah, I think our style really lends itself so well to the type of figures that we've got in Ghostlore. I
suppose with this particular selection that you've chosen, probably the biggest challenge for anything is either not treading on old ground, because obviously there are a few well-known favourites included in its covers, Icy. You can't sort of come up and try and release a hipster ghost book, because I don't think that would go down very well, because everybody would be like, hang on a minute, where's the hitchhikers? Where's the white ladies or whatever? But there are some fabulous books, and as we were joking before we started earlier, often we're all well read, and our normal friends will often ask us about strange things or strange stories and say, oh, do you know about this? And like, people at work must think, what does he do when he goes home? I'm sure they think other things as well, I see, going on my hobbies. But was it easy to know where to start with this? Or was it one of those that you had a framework of what you wanted to cover and what you wanted to touch on, and then you had to learn more about certain things as well?
I think originally, when we were sort of talking about doing a sequel to Rebel Folklore, the first issue was making sure we didn't include anyone who was already in Rebel Folklore, obviously, so as not to end up writing about the same figure twice. And I think because Rebel Folklore was about those figures, and that are kind of, in some cases, obviously, they're a bit more dangerous. If, for example, you were a man and you encountered one of them out on the highway at night, I think. But generally speaking, they were a bit more like shades of grey. There wasn't so much black and white, whereas with this one, I didn't have that brief, as it were. So it was more a question of, well, what are the different types of ghosts? But of course, obviously, you then get into this weird problem that you sometimes have with folklore as well, of, well, who classifies these things, and how do we decide what sits in what bucket. So, of course, some of these figures fit more into what I guess you might even call monsters. Some of them are more like supernatural creatures. Some of them are a bit more demonic. And then obviously, and I mean that in not so much in the Christian term, just the general concept. And then some of them are just, I don't want to say common or garden ghosts because that's silly, but like the poltergeist, for example, gets in there. But then we also have named ghosts as well that are there almost as an example of the type. So the Uniondale hitchhikers in there to represent phantom hitchhikers. There's so many to choose from around the world, but that one is just such an interesting case that it then came to stand in for a type. So some of them are a little bit more representative of their, I'm trying to think of a way of saying it without sort of falling over what I'm trying to say, but without, they're kind of like a type. Some of them are an individual figure, and then other of them are like almost a historical case. So it sort of balances the different approaches that people have taken throughout the history of people looking at these things to figure out, well, what exactly is the supernatural is essentially the driving force behind it, I guess. But that's why we wanted to have a bit of variety, because if I had just picked like 50 cases of hauntings around the world, it would have gotten really samey really quickly. But the minute you then go, well, actually, let's have Madame Koi Koi from Nigeria in there as well, because she's really unusual and really interesting story. But let's also have the Onryo in there from Japan, because you can't not talk about them if you're going to talk about ghosts. And let's have this and let's have that. So it kind of, I was trying not to have like a too scattergun an approach, but it was kind of what felt like they should naturally sit together.
I suppose that's the difficulty sometimes when you dive into writing a book in this particular field, Icy, as you say. I think it's one of those things people don't put much thought into it until they start building it, and then they go, hang on a minute, how many haunted houses can I keep writing about here? Because it's pretty much samey. So I suppose, was it a conscious decision? Whilst I know you mentioned there it's a bit like a scattergun, but I think it's far better to try and look at the varieties in this particular field rather than, because, you know, with the greatest respect, Icy, you could have written the favourite best white ladies of the world, really, because they're so synonymous around the world with hauntings. It's one of those things that you've got to be really careful not to just keep going on about a lovelorn bride left at the altar, takes her own life, she now haunts the area searching for her long lost love. After 3 of them, even as lovers of the strange, you go, oh, no, I get, all right, can we not get some kind of paranormal sort of conveyor to move some of these ladies into a more suitable area where they may find some wandering male ghosts who need a partner to look after?
That is a TV programme that we need. Never mind all the things like Love Island. I really want to see like Spectral Love Island. That would be amazing. Where you've sort of got to get, you've got this headless horseman over here, and then we've got this grey lady, and oh, if they could only meet, that would be phenomenal. I would 100% watch that.
Well, you know, as we were laughing earlier, with everything that you've got going on at the minute, and I was joking, all you need now is a game show. There you are. You can be the host of Spectral.
I'll quite happily be the new Claudia Winkleman of paranormal TV.
Hey, well, you've got the bangs for it.
And the eyeliner.
So were there some that you'd already got an idea of, you thought, I've got to have that particular case in? You know, like you mentioned about Uniondale and a couple of others. As I said, there's 2 or 3 of my favourite international stories in here, which, whilst I'm aware of them and think they're quite famous, I'm constantly surprised that people don't know either of them personally. I think it's a bit peculiar, especially, I suppose it sometimes shows you how held back sometimes the paranormal is outside of it, because I'm sure anybody who doesn't live in Britain gets really sick to death of hearing us classed as the ghost capital of the world, and we have major cities from England to Scotland to Wales arguing about who's the most haunted city in the whole island, be it York, be it Edinburgh, and then let them just get on with it and fight it out and see how many ghost tours you can have running in the same city at the same time. But I'm still surprised sometimes how little or how hard it is, it would seem, unless you really know your stuff or you know certain investigators or websites or authors who focus on international stories from particular regions, I see. It's not as easy as it seems, and I think because we're so immersed in it, we probably don't understand perhaps how difficult it can be for a normal reader of the supernatural to actually get into these different markets, as it were.
I think when you do a book like this, one of the things you run into quite quickly is we've got to focus on international stories, but how do you tell those without stepping on people from those areas?
Yes.
So you've obviously got to bear that in mind. And I always try to find accounts given by scholars from those areas, or indeed people from those areas. Reddit is fabulous for things like this. Or tourism sites where they're written by people in those areas, because then you sort of think, I want to hear the story from their perspective, because they're the ones who it fits in their cultural context. So you've got to bear that in mind first of all. And then you've also got to bear in mind you don't want to do too much that thing of, oh, that's just like our version of sort of their version of our thing, because again, I don't like that. And it's like, well, that can exist as a completely separate thing from ours, in the same way that we have particular spirits and so on that appear in Europe, for example, that you don't get in the rest of the world, because that's how culture works, and that's perfectly fine. And I think the other thing that I always run into, which I find quite interesting, is I found quite a lot of these figures. Obviously, some of them I hadn't heard of before, and then I went off and researched them, and I was like, oh no, I had actually heard of that. I just heard of it by a different name, for example, or it was just that long since I'd read about it, I'd forgotten. And some of them were genuinely new to me. Some of them, like when I was looking at this, I was like, I've got to put the story of Athenodorus and like the first haunted house story in there. That has to be in there. Yes. And I just love that story anyway, because it's just so funny. But I think the other thing that you run into, well, I didn't really run into this because I sit in that weird centre part of a Venn diagram where you've got ghosty stuff on one side and folklore on the other. And I think sometimes there can be a tendency in the paranormal world to go like, these are ghosts and that's it. And they'll look at the phantom hitchhikers, they'll look at the white ladies, they'll look at the creepy kid ghosts and things like that. But then anything that's a little bit more folkloric sort of gets forgotten about. And I think you get this with like Chihuahua, who's one of the South American figures that's in the book, or even to an extent the Ifrit as well. And you think, but they're both still supernatural. Why are they not being considered by people in the paranormal world? And I get this whenever I'm watching something like Uncanny, and they're like, oh, this is definitely a poltergeist. And I'm sitting there going, you've got a very angry house spirit on your hands. And I'm sort of like yelling the folklore equivalent at the telly. And it's like, oh, no, it's a poltergeist, it's a poltergeist. And I'm like, oh, you haven't been making offerings to your house spirit, which again would come from the more folkloric way of looking at things. And that's not to say one's better than the other, they're just different perspectives at the same thing fundamentally, and it comes down to that categorization issue that I mentioned before. But they're the things that you've got to kind of balance in your head when you're trying to come up with something like these sort of books, where you're sort of thinking, I want to appeal to a general reader who maybe has picked it up because it looked cool, but I also want it to be something that if someone who's really interested in the subject will read it and go, I didn't know that. So you sort of want to provide that. And I think ultimately, obviously, because it's like a 50,000 word book or something, it can't be exhaustive. So I always like to think of it that it's a bit like if you went to the weirdest like canapé type evening do, and I'm taking you around going, oh, by the way, have you met this person? This is the Dullahan. And oh, by the way, over here, we've got the Ridgeway ghost, and so on. And sort of like taking people around and making brief introductions, and then you can go back and talk to the one you're interested in more by looking them up. And that's why there's a massive resources list at the end of like podcasts and books and things and places where you can learn more about these figures, because it is kind of like more of an introductory, aren't these figures really interesting kind of, at least that's the aim anyway. I hope that's what I've done. Otherwise it's just a book where I'm going, oh, ghost, cool. It could be either.
Well, you have, but you've also done the other as well, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I mean, it's funny you mentioned the Dullahan, because I've just done a foreword for a book talking about Irish ghosts, and the Dullahan has always been my favourite. And I was introduced to it through the comedian Dave Allen, strangely enough.
Oh, I love Dave Allen. My mum saw him live.
Oh, no.
Yeah, apparently her table laughed so hard he bought them all a drink.
Oh, I mean, he was one of those people, strangely. I mean, he was an incredible comedian, a lover of the eccentric, but he also loved the ghosts. He loved, I mean, some of his stories he used to tell, especially the ones he always used to tell about why he got a bit of his finger missing,
Yeah.
were some of my particular favourites. But when I was doing this forward, I obviously mentioned the fact that it was Dave Allen who kind of got me into Irish hauntings, because I didn't know much about them. Obviously, you know, when we were growing up, we didn't hear much positive news coming from Ireland. We were always kind of given the government version of things. And these days, you know, I've been to Ireland a couple of times. I absolutely love it. I've yet to go to Northern Ireland, but I love it. And I've got to know people from there. I've worked alongside it. I've guests from there. I love it. But the Dullahan was the one that struck me. I love the whole sort of phantom horse and coach and headless man whipping them to a frenzy as they fly about everywhere. And since I've written this forward, I've seen it pop up 5 or 6 times. And I know we worry about our phones listening to us and things like this, but even when I've been reading other articles or flicking through things, I've suddenly realised it's been everywhere since I've sort of let it out into the world in the form of some words.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, the skeptic in me would be like, that's just that cognitive thing where, like, a bit like, you know, when you buy a car and you buy a red car and then everyone's driving red cars. The skeptic in me would go, oh, it's just that. But then the other part of me would be like, or, and this is the other possibility, who's to say that these kind of figures and phantoms and whatever you want to call them aren't knocking about in the other world and going, oh, do you know what? I really want some attention. And then periodically they just happen to get a bit more attention because they happen to tap on enough shoulders. And then, because I mean, I can't remember when I came across the Dullahan. I remember asking Morgan Daimler some questions about the Dullahan, because obviously if there's anything Irish related, Morgan is always my go-to expert.
Yes.
And I love Ireland. I love Dublin so much, and I really want to go back and see the rest of it, because I've got, like, ancestors from Cork and all that kind of thing, so I really want to see more of the place. But as I say, Morgan Daimler, the person that you want for anything Irish. And then the more I was looking into it, the more the Dullahan started popping up everywhere, and I was just kind of like, are you stalking me? Or haunting me would probably be a better word. And yeah, so it is funny how sometimes they do that, which is why I always love it whenever I do anything on the bar guest, who's also in there, who is like one of my favourite figures from northern folklore, which is kind of the reason why I sneaked the bar guest in. Whenever he popped up places, I always start seeing loads of, like, bar guest related stuff, and I'm always like, oh, there he is again. And I always find it, like, weirdly comforting. That I sort of feel like if any of the figures in this book were going to kind of pop up and look over your shoulder, he's like the one that would freak me out the least. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's good to see out one of our favourite northern spirits representing us, as it were, Icy, because, I mean, Barguest, Padfoot, wherever you want to call it round here, it's near enough the same thing as Northerners. There's not that much, but, you know, we've had a couple of, I think the last Barguest, Padfoot story that occurred round here was that somebody was attacked in Sheffield in the late 19th century. They were walking home after a good evening in the local hostelry, and a gigantic dog with flaming red eyes chased them past what is Endcliffe Park now and the botanical gardens, and pounced on them and pushed them to the ground, bruising their buttocks quite severely, Icy, and they were confined to their bed for a week until they had recovered sufficiently to be able to walk properly because of their bruised bottom.
That was their excuse.
No comment.
There's a brilliant one I found when I did a whole podcast episode on the bar guest, and I'm talking about them actually at the Haunted Landscape event at Conway Hall in November. And my favourite story that I came across was a Yorkshire one, and the whole thing's written in, like, Yorkshire dialect, so you've got to kind of get your ear in a little bit when you read it. And it's basically this guy who's coming home from the pub, and he swears he's not drunk about 4 times, and he keeps mentioning that he could see really clearly because it was a full moon, and he basically gets followed home by this, like, black dog. But it's way more mischievous because it does things where it kind of, like, disappears and then reappears again, almost like a tee-hee-hee, I'm still here. And then he crosses running water, because obviously that's the thing that you do with animals of the potentially fairy persuasion. And it still manages to keep up with him, and he's like, well, that would have to have found a crossing, and that's like 3 miles downstream, and oh my God. And then he gets home, and it's lying across, like, his front door. And then he hears his wife come into the door from the inside, and the dog's like, whoa, and scarpers, and just completely disappears. Of course, this guy gets an absolute sort of dressing down from his wife for being late, because obviously the bar guest is gone, so he's lost his excuse. And I just love the idea that the bar guest is like, I got you in trouble, haha, kind of thing. And there's just something so delightfully silly about how it just winds him up, but at no point does it hurt him, it doesn't injure him, it doesn't do anything technically malevolent, it's just annoying. And there's something of like the little child about that I really sort of appreciate. And I quite like the fact that, you know, obviously when you look at the Death Omen side of things, it's obviously a much more serious kind of sober sort of affair. But I really love that kind of like, I'm just going to annoy you on the way home and then disappear so you get in trouble. There's just something kind of weirdly spiteful about that I think is quite funny.
Absolutely. It still surprises me when I come across black dog stories from around the world, Icy, that I wasn't aware of. The latest one I've stumbled across is Oak Island, which is obviously famous for this mysterious lost treasure that's allegedly buried there. There is a black dog legend attached to both the island and the treasure, because one of the last people who died there were called the Restalls, ironically, which is one of those things that struck me, that their surname is one letter different to mine. Father and son died. They were killed by a gas leak in the pit that they were digging. And one of their workers, who was a native Micmac, which was the Canadian national tribe that lived there in that particular area, pulled their bodies out and rescued them. But he was saying a few weeks later, he was actually attacked in his bunk by a giant black dog spirit that basically told him that he'd done the wrong thing rescuing the bodies and he would regret it for the rest of his life, and then it slashed him on the chest and disappeared. And I thought, wow, I only found that about that for about a year ago. And it's amazing because I didn't realise how many of those types of stories are in North America, but there's blooming hundreds of them.
I don't know what it is about sort of dogs in particular, but black dogs, and I don't know if it's because, you know, they're never like a Labrador or like an actual breed of black dog, because of all the breeds I can think of being particularly, what's the word, intimidating, a Labrador's not one of them. No. And, you know, it is quite interesting when you start seeing figures like that popping up in different places, because then you start thinking, well, has that story been taken by immigrants from the British Isles? And obviously a lot of them would have been English. I know everybody often likes to point to the other ones, but there was a lot of English settlers or colonialists went as well. Or has that been something that is also intrinsic to other cultures, where they then kind of go, well, look, there's this one that just happens to be here as well, and you only know about it because of this, that, and the other. So you do wonder, like, but again, why a dog? Because you sort of think, surely in that part of the world, you could also have things like bears, which would be way more terrifying. But again, I'm splitting hairs here, really, but I think it ultimately is really interesting when you do get figures like that do just kind of pop up, and then other ones are like weirdly specifically local, and you only get them in one area. And then you get these other ones where they're like, oh, I fancy going to Canada now.
Yes. I mean, folklore is a malleable thing, I think. Yeah. And it certainly is in the modern era, and as it seems to be going through a massive renaissance, especially here in the UK, Icy, and long may that continue. And I mean, I'm one of those people who 10 years ago, I just wasn't particularly interested in it, really. Because I was an ignorant sop, I have to say. And now I absolutely love it, because I've completely broke through that kind of, oh, this is all a bit silly barrier. And once you burst through that, doing this show and speaking to people such as yourselves and other authors and researchers from around the world, you realise how closed-minded you are, regardless of the fact that you quite happily talk about people who claim to have sexual relationships with aliens, but you poo-poo at people who claim to have some kind of house elf. And you just begin to think, hang on a minute, Paul, what's the most unbelievable story of these two that you're comparing here? Is it the lady that says she's carrying an alien baby, or is it somebody that says they've got a friendly spirit in their house, Paul? Have a word with yourself.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to what I was saying before about the fact that in some circles, I think it's things like ghosts are fine, but like fairies are not. And I sometimes wonder, and this is just a theory, I've got nothing to back it up. I sometimes wonder if part of the reason why ghosts are considered acceptable, and I think that's possibly why like cryptids and UFOs sometimes fall in that bucket, but then things like fairies or just folklore in general kind of sits over here. But I'll come back to my thoughts on folklore more widely in a second. But I think because of the fact there's been such a scientific attempt to understand cryptids and ghosts and UFOs and all that kind of jazz, particularly since things like the formation of the SPR and whatnot, that they're almost deemed more acceptable fields of inquiry because someone's tried to quantify it and put numbers into it. And I think that, to me, sort of misses the point, because again you sort of think, well, why are we trying to separate these things out? And I've been guilty of that in the past, of trying to go, is that a ghost or is that a this or is that a that? Well, does it really matter fundamentally? You know, and I think it's also how people interact with things will depend on the language of their time. And I can't remember who I had this conversation with, but they were saying that obviously if you look at, for example, how things would have been described in Shakespeare's day, they appear in that because that's the language that people had at the time. And I was talking about this with Owen Davies and Kerry Holbrook the other day, that you get this language around hauntings changes as the hauntings in cinema change. To the extent I was on a ghost walk and I heard some woman confidently proclaim that she could smell sulphur when all I could smell was damp rock, because we were inside a crypt in Edinburgh in December.
Yes.
To not smell damp stone would have been weird. But why would someone identify sulphur, which is such a specific smell, unless they've watched a lot of ghost hunting programs where people are always banging on about the demonic? And I think this is where it is interesting which one comes first, the language or the depiction of it, because it's only when you get the depiction of it that you can get the language. So, and I think because fairies have sort of fallen out of fashion now, although people like Joe Hickey Hall and the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast are obviously really helping to make us go, well, actually...
Yes.
Should we also just not leave them alone? Because the folklore would suggest leaving fairies where they are, and that would be the safest thing to do. But I think in terms of folklore in general, one of the things that I find really interesting about it, and a lot of people can think it's a bit twee, and I think that because there's been such a TikTok trend and everything with it, and it's all like prancing around next to stone circles and all that kind of thing, and or practice and stuff, which then starts tipping into sort of the Wheel of the Year content, and that's fine. But folklore as a concept, I think, is a lot bigger because it's also about what people believe and why. And I had started noticing this when I was doing the animal-based podcast episodes that I've done. So it's like weird things that people thought, like, oh, if I scratch my throat with a mole's paw, it'll cure diphtheria. And it's like, I mean, it won't. But you then look at this and you look at some of those stupid things people have believed in the past, and you're like we're no better now. I see all kinds of it, particularly we saw this with COVID, a lot of the misinformation that people clung on to because it fitted the narrative they wanted to believe. And you get this with everything really, like whether it's the latest daft thing that a politician has done or said, and like there's millions of those to choose from, all the way through to the fact that some people still believe it's okay to use a mobile phone while driving. And people just continue to believe things based on their worldview. And you think, well, I know that's not strictly folklore, but it's still folklore itself demonstrates how people come to these beliefs and then stick to them, even when they've been given information to the contrary. And I think, so in a way, folklore is like a weird side offshoot to me of psychology, in a way, of that sticky wicket of what is belief and why do people come to beliefs, and why do some people change their beliefs and other people don't. You know, so it's kind of a bit of a far cry from getting away from like wishing wells and clutie trees and things all the way through to why do people believe conspiracy theories. It sounds like a bit of a jump, but that's to me what makes it really interesting, because this is the beauty of folklore. You can have both. You can have the wishing trees and the fairy wells and going to Bronze Age burial sites and leaving, well, you shouldn't really leave things, but you know what I mean, kind of like leaving sort of like offerings and whatnot for ancestors that may or may not be buried there. You can have all of that, but then you can also go, but this tells us something quite intrinsic about the human condition.
Very much so. I think it is. It's fascinating, really, because you can see how certain things have become so normalised that people don't consider it folklore.
Yeah.
And I find that mad, that when you said, don't walk under a ladder. Well, why? oh, well, I'm just being sensible. Well, you're not really. It's bad luck. Why? And so therefore, you are prescribed to a folklore belief. No, I'm not. It's just sensible. Okay, knock on wood. Why are you knocking on wood? What are you on about? You know, that's folklore. And it's amazing how many little things people who think that, oh, it's nonsense, it's all very silly, and yet they'll touch things for good luck, or they'll have a lucky clover, or you know, in the old days, rabbit's foot. And like you say, I mean, as you mentioned, you did some brilliant episodes about the strange things about animals. And I'm always interested in foxes. But I remember once having a conversation with someone who was essentially ascribing Einstein-like intelligence to foxes. And basically saying, yeah, they're malicious. They're deliberately malicious. As though it was like Nasty Nick off EastEnders, Icy. He created this whole persona of the fox personality to justify his support for fox hunting. And I was like, but there's no evidence for that. You're basically giving human personality to an animal to justify barbarism. Mm-hmm. And it's nonsense. But it's not just that. You know, you see it about if you see a hare doing a certain thing on a certain day, oh, you're in trouble now. And yet people, depending on where they are or how connected to the modern world they think they are, everybody in some form, in a normal day, I suspect, especially in the UK, will do something that is considered folklore. It's just become so normal. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's quite funny because when you think of how many people in a few weeks' time will go to a fireworks display. I mean, round my way, they've been setting them off to celebrate the fact it's 7:53 in the evening.
Yes.
For no apparent reason. And so how many people are going to go and celebrate that, even though we kind of have no real connection with any of that, and nobody really does penny for the guy anymore. So
no,
it's just fireworks essentially now, and I think, you know, for various reasons. Or how many people will? Oh, this one irritates me. The Halloween fancy dress thing, but it's now for adults. But everybody always, like, women in particular, always want. Actually, I shouldn't say that, but they always want to kind of be like the sexy version of something. No one needs to see a sexy Crayola crayon. That's just weird. But like, how many people? And I suppose obviously because Halloween, like obviously fancy dress for adults gives you an opportunity to do something that you don't really get the chance to do. Sort of like the rest of the time, which let's be honest, we had this with all the different 12th night customs or the Saturnalia rituals or any of the Lord of Misrule things that you have. Humans have tried to find some way to upend the status quo for centuries. And you think, so in a lot of ways, that woman being a sexy Crayola crayon or the man dressed as Wonder Woman, I always love to see those ones though, because they're always quite funny. Or, you know, that stag do that have gone out as the Ghostbusters, like they've... you know, and they've happened to do it at Halloween, they've sort of tapped into that same desire to have that kind of upending even of the status quo. And I think it is quite funny when you look at how many people will do things like really basic, like tossing a coin in a fountain to make a wish, blowing out candles on a birthday cake, that lovelock thing, which I don't fully understand the point of, or any kind of funereal customs. The fact, like, sending flowers to someone when they've lost a loved one, like, that's a custom, so that makes it folklore in a way. And I think that there's a huge difference to me between folklore and folk tales. So folk tales can sometimes be like the twee thing that you get told at like an English heritage site or something. Whereas because folklore, to me, there often feels like there's a degree of someone's doing a thing or believing a thing. That's the one that people are most likely to come into contact with sort of during a given day. And I do wonder, I don't know how many people necessarily think it is just something that's a bit silly, or they recognise on some level that they do it. Or how many people who are outside of the folklore space just don't really give it a second thought at all, but they will, like you say, quite happily practice all of these different things. It's like people who name their cars. I mean, we do, because, you know, why not? You say hello when you get in. You know what I mean? Why wouldn't you? This thing is taking you from A to B. I see no problem with that, because to me it's kind of almost like that level of almost like whimsy and sort of like re-enchantment of like the mundane world. I don't think is a bad thing, particularly living under the hellscape that is late stage capitalism. But I think that I think people probably would be surprised when they actually stop and think about what they're doing and go, oh wow, where did that thing come from? Why am I doing that? And sometimes it might be a family tradition. So it's just something that your family has always done for like the last 50 years and nobody can really remember why. Or it's something that you start doing for a laugh. For example, my dad and I always watch V for Vendetta every November the 5th for obvious reasons. And my mum just can't get her head around that. But my dad and I will always watch V for Vendetta, and then we always watch Die Hard on Christmas Eve because it's got to be done. And you always cheer when Ellis dies. And he's just so odious. But it is one of those sort of things, and every time we go, it's like Sheets and Dim Fenster, you always have to go shoot the glass and stuff. You have these little traditions and stuff, and I think it is just part of what makes humans human, really. And I think that it's nice it's having a resurgence, but I hope that people look beyond like the trends on social media and start to actually look into like, well, what's the local equivalent where you are? You know, this person shared a snippet of folklore about a plant, for example. Is that native to your area? Is it a favourite? Is it a birth flower for you or whatever? Birth month flower would be a better way of saying that. And it's so I don't know. I hope that people who do stumble across it actually realise that it does have the ability to add something to your day, even if it's something that may not actually have any direct impact on you. It just makes you feel a little bit better or makes you look at the world in a new way.
I don't know what the catalyst has been. Maybe it is social media, maybe it is TikTok that has connected so many younger people who seem to have been really disenfranchised by modern life, and they've come towards it. Have you noticed in where you are, Icy? I know you're not that far away, but you know, we're still northerners, but you know, there's a fair bit between us. Have you noticed a resurgence in the younger crowd and a sort of real interest in local folklore? Because that was the other thing here, is that they've really started to connect with our local standing stone sites or our local folkloric locations and legends and practices. I mean, they've just had an Apple event at the weekend that was delayed a week because storms don't care about solstices. So they had to delay it a week. But they had a wonderful apple pressing to welcome in the autumn harvest. And to see a group of 20 and 30-year-olds fully embracing these kind of things, for me, it's quite emotional in a positive sense that, you know, everybody says, oh, the next generation, they're all useless. But I found it really inspiring that the people that we've had to fight to bring folklore back to the mainstream. And yet it seems to have skipped a generation, and all the guys who apparently don't give a damn about the modern world are all sort of gravitating sort of away from what they're supposed to be into.
I mean, there has unfortunately been in some cases a little bit of a tendency for the far right to try and co-opt bits of folklore, although they get their fingers on everything, really. But I think one of the things I've noticed is, obviously I do talks in Newcastle at the fabulous venue that is Newcastle Castle, and we do the talks in like the Barbican, which dates to like the 13th century. Yeah. Thankfully they've obviously refitted it since then. But the thing that I always find quite fascinating is the cross-section, like you say, of people at the talk. So obviously if there's kids there, it's because their parents have taken them. But I think because I'm quite family friendly in the way that, like, I don't swear and stuff like that, and I tend to try and skip where I can the graphic stuff. Yeah. I occasionally, like, I've just done an episode on like Bedlam and then Newgate Prison, and it's like, well, I've got to like tone these down a little bit because I don't want to then basically tip into being a true crime podcast, because that's not really my thing. I love true crime, but I don't want to do a podcast on it. But I think that, so obviously the kids can at least come along and take something from it. And I know I did some, so as I say, so I get that. I get obviously people like my own age, a little bit younger, mostly a lot older. And they're brilliant because they come up to the end and they say, oh, I've got this story about this place, or this thing happened to me. And I'm like, oh, please tell, because it's like brilliant. This is like literally collecting folklore in action. But I did an event at the Great North Museum, Hancock, which was brilliant. And I was telling sort of stories from Victorian Newcastle this Christmas, and it was amazing again how many kids were in the audience. We're talking like 9 or 10, and they were coming up and asking these really, really insightful questions. And obviously, so I was trying to answer them as best that I could, and it was just really cool to sort of see these younger people who obviously were still at that point where they haven't like discovered cynicism yet. So I was like, they're learning like a questioning mindset through folklore. And I think anything that teaches critical thinking has to be a good thing. And yes. I think that's the thing that I've noticed, because like I teach sort of HE students, it's like anywhere from 18 up over, and I find every year there's at least 2 or 3 who absolutely love folklore. So I had one student who actually for his final project made a zine about Rutland's folklore. It was phenomenal because he wrote it, he illustrated it, was really, really good. And he was really into it, and it was really lovely to see someone engaging with their local folklore. And I've seen this before where, you know, sort of students get into tarot or whatever, and then they kind of take like a branch off into mythology, for example, and then that takes them into folklore. And I think that there is a really lovely tendency among sort of the younger generation, which makes me feel old as well, to be honest. But like as an elder millennial, when I look at sort of the ones coming through, there is something really nice about the way that they're kind of like, I'm really interested in this thing, so I'm going to go and learn more about it because I have like the internet in my hand. And I really love the fact that they are going off and investigating things and coming up with really interesting perspectives, or linking particularly folklore and pop culture, which obviously I'm really interested in, having like an art and film background. Yeah. So I do think that it's going to be really exciting to see where they take folklore next, because some of them are so like tremendously inventive. You think you're just going to make your own customs up, and that's really cool. And quite honestly, whatever customs you come up with is going to be a bit more exciting than painting flags on roundabouts.
And probably more beneficial to the community in real terms.
Well, exactly.
Councils aren't wasting their budgets cleaning crap up.
No.
We can invest it in where it's needed, in vital services, instead of repainting all these bloody roundabouts. But in regards to the book, as we said, there are some fascinating ones. So I'm always delighted when I see a book that mentions Fisher's ghost. I have always loved this story, Icy. And it's one of them stories that I can't tell you when I learnt about it. It seems to have been with me all my life. I don't know why. So I probably read about it as a kid when I was devouring true ghost stories from around the world, from the school library, or one of my relatives had found a ghost book, the world's scariest ghost stories or something like that. But the thing about Fisher's ghost is this is a real event.
Yes.
This really happened. We've got newspaper reports. It was widely reported. It's a bit of true crime. And it's one of the best examples of a ghost getting revenge from beyond the grave through the judicial system, which is not as rare as I think some people think, because it's not the only case of its kind.
Yeah, and I think when I mentioned before I like true crime, this is one of the things I love about a lot of ghost stories, because there is that dovetail with the real cases. And I think what's really interesting with this one, because obviously there's the version that people hear, so there's the legend, but then when you actually look at what actually happened, it is also just as bizarre. It's less Hollywood, but it's also still an interesting story. And I think the fact that the idea that the person who claimed to see this guy, or this ghost of this guy sitting on a fence and then pointing at the field and then go and have a look in the field and, oh, there's his remains and blah, blah. The idea that he may have invented seeing the ghost because he didn't want to say, I know where the remains are. But if you go, a ghost pointed them out. It always makes me think of the Red Barn murder with Maria Martin and the way that her stepmother claimed to have dreamed where her body was, which just seems a bit odd considering the fact that there was no real relationship between these two people other than this was her stepmother, but they were kind of like the same age. So I always kind of think of the Fisher's ghost story in the same way, in that is the ghost invented in order to allow somebody to tell the truth without having to actually give too much away and potentially implicate themselves, or at least the fact that they knew some information, or is it actually the case of a ghost getting justice from beyond the grave, in which case they've actually done better than a lot of living people have. So it's a really interesting story, whichever way you look at it.
It is. And often these are the kind of cases, because as I say, there are a couple of other ones before, but I'd rather keep on Fisher before I divert, and the way my brain decides to go down a rabbit hole, Icy, as often does in this. It's very hard to keep myself on track when I get excited about ghosts and court cases. This is one of those stories from that early period of Australian settlement. People were just getting big swathes of land. Fisher's ghost is basically an argument that starts about a fence between two rival ranchers, or whatever they want to call it, free men or whatever. And one guy tries stealing land. They have a disagreement. And Fisher disappears. And he's one of those stories. It's the kind of thing you see on EastEnders. Oh, he's gone to Manchester. We'll never see him again. You know, or Coronation Street, they always leave Manchester to go to London. And it's like they've flown to LA or something. London? Oh, how will we ever see you again? I don't know. Jump on a train. It's an hour and a half. You'll be fine. Which is, it makes you laugh sometimes. But these are the kind of things. Oh, where's Fisher? Oh, he's moved away. He's going to see some family. And so, you know, Australia's a big place. If somebody goes away in 1820, it's going to take him a month to get there and a month to get back. So the story is okay for a bit. And then all of a sudden, he's got a bit more land. And clearly, I don't think people took very long to think, we don't think Fisher's visiting relatives. We think something bad might have happened to him.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think is quite interesting is obviously the fact that the Fisher does sign his land over to this other guy, who's sort of the one who ends up being the main suspect, George Worrell. He does sign his land over to him as he's facing arrest, with the idea of, like, you look after it for me, so, like, it won't be seized by anyone. But of course, then, because he doesn't want to give it back, when Fisher's basically sort of, because he's been facing arrest. So Fisher is not a squeaky clean person to start with. So he's so yeah, it is a little bit like a disagreement between the Mitchell brothers. And so of course, obviously when Fisher then comes back and he's like, right, I want my land back, and then Worrell's like, well, no, actually, I'm going to keep it. And then Fisher disappears, and then all of a sudden sort of Worrell's like, oh yeah, no, actually, I've got the paperwork. So there's almost this weird kind of appeal to the legal system to kind of work in his favour, and to sort of go, well, actually, yeah, he did sign it over to me, so I haven't stolen it. And there's a deviousness to that, which sort of almost falls apart when he then starts selling Fisher's clothes and sells his horse and all this. And he tries to almost dispose of any other assets too quickly. And obviously that's what then draws people's suspicions. And I think, you know, the fact that when he's arrested, he then just wildly accuses these four other men. It's like, well, why? What have they got to do with it? And I think, obviously, with policing being rudimentary in those days, and obviously that's no aspersions, it's just, you know, the methods they would have at their disposal and what have you. Yeah. I think you do think, well, you know, it would be really difficult to investigate something like that, particularly, as you say, the size of Australia. So if someone said they've left, you'd be like, I can't afford to spare a man to go and check. I can't just phone someone and say, oh, we can't use CCTV and all the things that people might do now. Where have they checked into on Google? You know, it's not really the same thing. But I do love the fact that when the boys find the blood stains on the fence and they're kind of like, oh, this isn't right. I do love the fact that the constable has a look. He's like, I can't find anything. And he brings in an expert and hires like a local Indigenous tracker. And he finds the actual remains. And I love that, because it's like, the constable kind of defers to someone who knows far, far better than him. And I love the fact that that was his recourse of, I need an expert. So he got sort of this Indigenous man to find him. And I think that's the point for me where I feel like Worrell's really done for, because, you know, he's tried to be clever with the paperwork, but then he's forgotten, like, physical evidence, which sort of seems a bit... I can understand, again, why you would somewhere like Australia, when there's that many different sort of predators and things like that you could argue somebody had met, like, an unfortunate end by accident. I mean, again, this happened in Home and Away nearly every other week from what I can remember. The red-backed spiders in particular always seem to appear periodically, and someone was always bitten by one. And I've always thought that was a bit odd. But I think it is just inherently a really interesting story, because that's the real version, which is still kind of cool. And then you suddenly have the, oh yeah, but no, it was a ghost who pointed. And you kind of go, oh, okay. But that's the version that people choose to believe, even though the original is still kind of bonkers, but still interesting. But then instead it's like, no, it's a ghost.
What always makes me chuckle is that obviously the town where this happened has embraced this with all its heart. And they've held a festival. I think it'll be the 70th anniversary next year, Icy, since it started. I think it was 56. So, well, yeah, 70 years. So it's one of those places that, regardless of the origin story of it, it's put this place on the map. What makes me chuckle about this is that depending on which version of the story you read, on top of the real event, which was a murder over land, that, as you say, the indigenous people saved the police's arses on that particular occasion. Oh, no, because they've been there and they've not found anything. And he was like, yeah, there's definitely human remains here. Look, here's a tooth. Oh, yeah. I think somebody might have been murdered. Oh, how did you find that? Because he's looked, probably. And, I mean, because some kids found blood stains all over the place that the police had missed as well. It's like, what's going on here? You've got kids and indigenous peoples, and they're not the people charged with sorting this case out. And the policeman's like, oh, thanks, everyone. It's like a Scooby-Doo episode, or, or Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys or something. The Australian version. But there are two versions of the ghost story. You've got one where Fisher's ghost is seen sat on a fence pointing to where his body lays. But the version most people are aware of is Fisher is on a bridge. Yeah. And so people have a vigil on this bridge. The trouble is, it's not the same bridge. And it's further down the river from where it originally was, which is fine. But why would he know that they've moved the bridge? Or will he... I mean, this is the wonderful thing. You kind of think, well, will he just appear floating somewhere pointing instead? Because it's one of those marvellous things about this story is, yes, people go to this bridge, but it's not the same place. It's like the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant. The new bridge is not where the old bridge was. And so sometimes people will go there to try and take in the atmosphere, but you're like, well, you're on the wrong bridge. This isn't the one that collapsed, obviously.
Maybe that's why they don't see him, because they're all on the new bridge and he's actually hanging out just in the middle of nowhere being like, where is everyone?
Just floating about.
Yeah. Yeah, it is quite interesting, I think, again, because obviously in the version where he sits on a fence, he obviously sort of points just randomly to this field, and I think he points up a creek on the one on the bridge, and again, it's sort of like that. I'm trying to think of the best way to word it. It is that sort of sense of pointing to something that would otherwise be like inaccessible. So obviously, how would you know that remains were there unless because the person told you they'd put them there? Because I think the guy who sort of said he'd seen him wasn't the same as the suspect, and I think he knew him. Yes. And then obviously alternatively the ghost himself did it, and you think, well, either way that's still quite a story. But it's the fact that like the idea that the version with the ghost could even take off, that people would go, yeah, actually that's plausible. Again, it just goes back to what people will actually believe and what stories people spin as well. And I think, again, which all just makes it really interesting to look at how people come to the conclusions that they do.
I mean, as I said as well, this is not the only example of a ghost being involved, allegedly, solving a case. I mean, there are two very famous ones. Obviously, here in the UK, we've got the murder in the Red Barn, which happened in Suffolk, which was a woman was murdered by her lover. Once again, she'd gone away. She'd gone away. She'd not told any of the family or friends, but she'd gone away. Her partner had said she'd gone away, but she hadn't, obviously. Her mum was convinced by nightly dreams where her daughter's ghost was coming, wasn't it? Was it the stepmother or the mother?
It was a stepmother, because that's why I mentioned it before. There were I think they were quite close in age, and there was actually one rumour at the time that the stepmother was actually having an affair with the guy who'd killed Maria, and that this was her way of getting back at him, because the idea was that Maria and that William Corder were going to run away together, and they go off to the exotic locale of Ipswich, and obviously he claims that she went on ahead and then never joined her, but then continue to like write letters claiming that she'd hurt her hand, and that's why her handwriting looked really weird and all that kind of thing. And yes, so some people think that the stepmother actually basically concocted the dreams to essentially get her own back on him for dumping her for the younger model, as it were.
Yes, but that's one of those that seems to drop in and out of fashion, because for me it's quite a well-known story. I'm always amazed when I see a YouTube notification, the amazing Red Barn story, as though it's one of those. It's like when you see somebody who starts a social media post with hot take, and they then usually describe one of the most highly rated films of all time being underrated. And you're like, what? What are you talking about? Stop posting things. But you've also got, in America, is it the Greenbrier case?
Yeah, the Greenbrier ghost is an interesting one because of the fact that it's another one of those ones where you don't get like continual sightings of the ghost after what happened, in the same way that obviously you do with, for example, any common or garden grey lady who often appears on the anniversary of something and things like that. And I think the Greenbrier ghost is this woman, Zona Hester, who marries basically a bit of a local wrong'un, for want of a better word, and her mother hated him, apparently, and the fact he's supposed to have killed his first wife and whatnot probably didn't go very far in his favour. But then after the daughter dies, in somewhat suspicious circumstances, the mother then claims that her daughter's come to her in a dream and sort of told her what's happened to her. And I think she says that her husband had... Oh, did he say that he'd broken her neck or something?
Yeah, it was really... Because it's one of those, I see, where, as you mentioned about how crap the police officers were in the Fisher case, this is one of them where somebody goes around to examine the body but doesn't look at her head or neck because he dressed her again. Yeah, because he lays her out in what I think the dress she got married in. Yes. Which,
to be fair, like, you wouldn't have had that many clothes in those days, so I can understand that if someone was going to be buried, you would put them in their nicest dress, which was probably what they got married in. So people kind of have visions of her in, like, a bridal gown, but obviously that kind of wedding clothes hadn't really come in at that point in terms of the fashion. But you also think, like, that's tampering with evidence, man. What are you doing? And I think eventually somebody did actually have a look, and I think that a couple of people were a bit like, that's really weird that she would highlight an issue with the neck when she couldn't possibly have known that because the police at the time didn't. So it's not like she's dreamed, in inverted commas, information that was already available. She's come out with this almost completely out of left field, really. But of course, because of this, then the fact obviously it's the mother and almost the evidence given by Zona post-mortem through a mother's dreams actually helped to convict him of murder. So in this case, it actually really doesn't work in his favour. Well, I suppose it actually doesn't work in any of their favour. So it is quite interesting, this kind of weird theme of the ghost coming back and going, but. And I think it's possibly part of a desire to kind of make sure that people don't then go around committing murder, because it's like, but you might think you've gotten away with it, but your victim could always testify from beyond the grave. So it sort of becomes like a bit of a cautionary tale, and that's like a legal drama I would quite like to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of those cases that I think doesn't get talked about enough, because like you say, the thing that's always struck me about that is that the mum said, she's got a broken neck, you need to check it out. And they've no idea what she was talking about, because it's one of the, she's just passed away. Yeah, as people... Well, to be fair, there were plenty of viruses and diseases around at the time, Icy, that would lay out people left, right and centre. You only have to look at, diphtheria and consumption and yellow fever and typhoid. These diseases that are next to hardly heard of these days, but in those days they're extremely virulent and would wipe out great swathes of towns and villages almost overnight, it would seem. And so on face value, it's not surprising that a young woman would die in the prime of her life. However, being so specific and being able to have that proven as the reason your daughter had died is the one thing that's kind of elevated the Greenbrier case a little bit for me, because nobody knew that. So how did she know? It's not a guess, is it?
Well, yeah, and I think what's really interesting is because when the doctor comes in to have a look at her, she's like dead at the foot of the stairs, so you might assume that she's just fallen. But because nobody examines the body, because obviously a fall down the stairs would give you multiple bruises and injuries. And obviously, I mean, I've fallen down the stairs before a few times. Once was when I was 18 months old, so I think I've got an excuse. And the second time I was wearing 7-inch platforms and decided it was a good idea not to hold on to the handrail. So I went the entire length of a staircase at Oxford Circus Tube Station. Because I was going on a night out, so you basically would have just seen this like 6'1" goth just tumble down the stairs. And I walked away with like a split knee and a couple of bruises, so I limped away. So you can absolutely 100%, and that was concrete stairs as well. I really wish I'd asked for the security footage for that. It must have looked tremendous. But you absolutely can survive like a fall down. It will hurt a bit. You might break an arm or a leg, and depending on how you fell, obviously it could be fatal. But
yes,
it's the fact that it's almost like the body's being positioned there to imply that. But again, to then specifically go a broken neck off the back of that, it's almost like too specific, if that makes sense. And I think that I mean, there's obviously other bits to the story as well, which are quite interesting, about other things that may have been going on in advance with them. But I think that the amount of stuff that wasn't looked into, probably like the young boy who I think actually found her, like the local neighbour, because for some reason the husband asks him to look in on her, because he's working at, I think he's a blacksmith or something, so he's basically at work, and he asks this young boy who's one of the neighbours to go and have a look. So he's the one who finds the body. So it's kind of like going, oh, well, she must have fallen while I was out at work. So he's trying to kind of give himself an alibi and all that kind of thing. But like nobody really bothers to ask the young boy what he saw. Like his testimony's obviously taken down at some point because it's come down to us through history, but nobody really paid any attention to it. And you're like, this kid was like the first eyewitness and the first to enter the crime scene. Like, come on. And obviously nowadays we'll look at this from the benefit of forensics and we're just like, what were you doing? But it still is quite interesting because of the fact that the mother's dream does seem to have other elements that she couldn't possibly have known that hadn't been made public. You do kind of go, oh, there is something a bit weird about that one.
They are great, and they make a nice change from people suing God in court or... which has happened before. There's a case I think there was a case from Romania, which always makes you... He was a convicted murderer, Icy, and whilst he was in prison, he started a court case against I'm trying to think Romanian Orthodox Church, I think it was. And essentially, he was blaming them and God for him falling under the influence of Satan and committing these murders, and therefore he wasn't actually liable. It was their fault. Wow. You'll be unsurprised to know that the case was thrown out.
Oh, you surprise me.
But it makes a change from like people suing over buying a haunted house. The haunted house story always makes me laugh. The Ackley case, I think it is, from New York. Yeah. That woman who said, oh yeah, I've got a haunted house. My house is full of ghosts. And somebody bought it and went, oh, we didn't know it was haunted. Yes, she did.
And it's in the local press and it's all over the place. Like this woman like sells the fact that the house, like it's on like a haunted house walk and everything. Like you could not have, unless you basically had come from another country and just taken no interest in the local area, you could not have known this reputation beforehand. And that's what always makes me chuckle when my mum likes watching quite a lot of the property programmes. And people will walk in and the first thing they say is, oh, isn't it lovely at whatever the house is? It can be the most bland country cottage chic ever, and it's always lovely. And they're always talking about, like, how many bedrooms has it got? Is it big enough for entertaining? Nobody goes, is it haunted? Nobody. That would be the first question I would ask.
Me and you both. Well, moving from Australia, I think the best place to take our journey into one of the other stories you cover here is another one of my favourites from South Africa. And this is one that I discovered about 30 years ago, Icy, through the Michael Aspel Strange But True TV series. Wow. When the paranormal was prime time, before Danny Robbins and ghosts dragged it back into coolness again. And I always used to like that. There's a lot of stories from round here on that particular show. I don't know why, but it introduced a lot of people to a lot of things. It introduced me to Pete, the child ghost, the friendly poltergeist that lived in that lawnmower repair shop. And then when they sold it, he moved in with the old guy and his wife for a bit. You got the UFOs over the Peak District bothering a woman and her husband's like, oh, you just don't know how to use a car. You know, those type of things. But this one is one of those that's always stuck with me, primarily because there's 3 eyewitnesses interviewed in this particular segment, including one of the guys who picked her up on his motorbike. This is a tragic story that is a real event. You've got this couple driving through this particular area of South Africa. It's one of those beautifully stunning desert landscapes that they've got down there. It's incredible. And so it's one of those strange things because it's a very straight road. It's the kind of road it would be harder to have an accident on than not, it seems, from all the topography I've seen and the people who live in the area. It's renowned for being a real straight road. It's not long after this car crash where the female in the car dies, ironically on Good Friday, which is another aspect of this that seems to come into play down the years. And then very quickly, South Africa seems to develop one of the best hitchhiker ghosts in the history of ghosts, really.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one as well, because I love a good phantom hitchhiker. And I remember during lockdown, the incomparable Owen Davies was tweeting about phantom hitchhikers. And I remember I had replied and said, I wonder what all the phantom hitchhikers are doing during lockdown, because there'll be nobody out to pick them up. So I just had visions of them all kind of standing there, really really like disappointed by the side of the road, like, well, this isn't working. My brain works in really weird ways. But in this story, a lot of the time they're just these really anonymous stories of this person was in a crash. Particularly, we get this with the Blackwall phantom hitchhiker, in Blackwall Tunnel. But with this one, we have a name. People even know what she looked like. There was an identity attached to it, and I think that's what's really interesting. So she's called Maria Rue, and I think they lose control in the rain. And I think when you have that kind of torrential rain, I mean, they're in a VW Beetle. It's not like a Range Rover or something, you know. It's not a car that's necessarily built for extreme weather. But like you say, Good Friday, 1968, lose control. Unfortunately, there's this fatal crash. And then weirdly, it takes 8 years till Good Friday in 1976, when a man spots a woman, she's hitchhiking, he stops to pick her up, and she doesn't disappear at the destination like some phantom hitchhikers do. Like, she just disappears out of the car, like, at some distance down the road, so she doesn't seem to go very far. But obviously the driver's really freaked out, because he's like, 1 minute she's there, next minute she's not, and obviously he gets the police involved, and they actually follow him in their car. Obviously, because they're like, this is a really weird thing to have happen, like, what's going on? But then he takes them back to the spot where she actually disappeared. And one of the police officers then says he sees the driver's passenger door open and close by itself. And you sort of think, well, I know people have a lot of opinions on the police and everything, but at the same time, there's no reason for that police officer to report seeing that. That is a weird point in the story. But then there's other drivers have sort of said that they've had this situation where their car door has opened and closed on its own. So there's a few other times journalists have shown Maria's photo to the drivers and they've gone, that's her, that's the woman. And obviously then they find out what happened to her. The freakiest one is the motorcyclist, who then just suddenly feels arms around his waist while he's like driving along. And then all of a sudden, he starts feeling these knocks on his helmet, so he slows down, and then when he gets down about sort of whatever it is, miles per hour, the arms disappear, and it's almost like she's left as if she's wanting him to slow down, like he's going too fast or something. And then obviously he realises, you know, that she's gone, but she hasn't fallen off because there's no one in the road. But the spare helmet's back where he left it, even though he'd given it to her and stuff. So I think it's really interesting that you've got these really like super specific encounters that people have with her, that are so different from the ones where it's just some random hitchhiker that people don't know who it is. And I think having a name, and obviously like our partner who was in the car, who was driving, obviously could give you an indication of her character and what she was into, and you feel like there's a real person involved, because there was. And I don't know if that possibly explains why the sightings are a little bit more concrete, but you think the number of them that there've been do seem like weirdly similar to a degree, where it's not like they're copying each other, because there's enough details that they're slightly different, but it's always the same place. It's always Good Friday, which I always kind of am a little bit like, but Easter does move around the year, so how does she know it's Good Friday? That bit always fascinates me, but that's just me being pedantic. But I do think that, you know, I can't remember when the last time that she was seen was, if she's been seen particularly recently. But again, you get that age-old thing of what if nobody drives on that stretch of road on Good Friday?
Yeah.
Is she just standing there waiting for someone? And I just think that's an awful, awful mental image. But I feel like she's a really interesting case because we can say this is who she is and this is what happened to her and this is what people have reported after that particular incident. So I think she, for me, stands out among a lot of the Phantom Hitchhiker ones as somebody who you can actually be really sorry about what happened to her because you know who she is.
What strikes me about this particular one is the fact that we've got witnesses in cars and motorcycles. So it's almost as if this spirit is showing a level of intelligence.
Yes.
Because how you, without wishing like I'm trying to presume people are stupid, I see, being in a car and being on a motorbike are very different ways of travelling. And so whatever's going on has to understand the difference because, as you say, the motorcyclist, I've seen his interview. It's in that episode that I mentioned. He's not the kind of man, looking at him, that it would be one for telling tall tales and stuff and nonsense. Let's just say that. He looks like the kind of man who, when he finishes drinking a bottle of beer, he eats it. He's one of those chaps. But he seems very nice. But I wouldn't like to get on his wrong side, Icy. You know what I mean? Like you say, his experience is clearly very different because he feels the arms around. As far as he's aware, this is a physical person. He's stopped to get on his bike. But you've got these little nuances like putting the helmet back on the pillion where it should be. Compared to the guy in the car, the doors opening. The one thing about that is the police went and did it with him and watched it happen. And then they put him in the police car and did it. And it happened again. So it happened to their car as well as his. They were both interviewed on that show as well. So you've got a South African police officer going on television and saying, we think we've experienced a ghost here. Which, why would you? Why would you do that? And especially, let's not forget, when this was all going on, this was apartheid.
Yeah.
You know, this was a very controlled political country where bad news did get out occasionally, but we'd no idea about most of the things that were happening in South Africa until sort of the latter point of the 80s. Which, ironically, this show was 5 or 6 years after the fall of apartheid, and Mandela was president by that point. However, you still got these people who were in that period who were quite willing to come forward and talk about it on a internationally syndicated television show, Icy. That's not something someone would do if it was just a bit of a laugh.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. And the other thing that always strikes me when you sort of look at the people who haven't had encounters with her, there's always a degree of distress of, oh my God, what's happened to this person? And you almost feel like obviously it would freak you out just from the simple thing of this person was in my car and now they're not. And obviously for the motorcyclist, he's really worried that she's fallen off. But you do sort of think like that is the fact that they clearly have quite a high degree of empathy and concern for other people, is that why she picks them? And things. So you sort of think, is she trying to get them to be safe on that stretch of road, or is she just reminding people that she's there? We don't know. We don't know what her motivations are. But I think that there is something particularly about this one that does strike me as being really desperately sad. But also, I mean, obviously anything involving a death would obviously be sad, and you kind of need them for ghosts. But I think this one in particular, it kind of caught my attention when I read it, and I was kind of like, that is very different from the other Phantom Hitchhiker ones, which almost take on a degree of like the urban legend, because it's like, oh, a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend's hairdresser's mum's sister said, and then you're like, okay. Whereas with this one, because of the specificity of it, and again, the appeal to authority with police officer testimony, you do kind of have to go, something very odd happened there.
Absolutely. I mean, it is one of those things. I know, as you say, and you mentioned it in the book, obviously the famous book on this particular subject, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, which I think anybody who's interested in the supernatural has to own a copy. If you're very lucky, you might drop on it in a charity shop, as I did many years ago, for 50p.
Nice.
But you never know. Absolutely. I love a rummage. And not many can compare to that particular case at all. I think, for me, I think next to Roy the carpet fitter from Luton, I think it's probably my favourite Phantom Hitchhiker story, because there's clearly something strange gone on. And I remember people talking about probably the most famous one in the UK is the ghost of Bluebell Hill. And people say, oh, it's all a friend of a friend. When I was looking into, strangely enough, I was finding some hitchhiker stories for a friend of mine who thought they were brilliant. And so I sent him the first two I mentioned, Roy, the carpet fitter, and the South Africa one. But whilst I was doing that, I stumbled across an article and an interview with a guy who was 100% adamant, I think from 1971, I think, that he had picked up the lady on Bluebell Hill. He was absolutely convinced, because every time I've seen people talk about that story, they've gone, it's nonsense. It's an urban myth. There's no witnesses. Well, I found one, and it's a big article, picture of him and everything, and he looks, as you would imagine a 60-year-old man in 1971, look, the horn-rimmed glasses on and a wavy, greasy hair and, one of those strange cardigans with velvet patches on his elbows. He couldn't look any more 1971 if he tried, Icy. But he's there. So that then straight away goes, well, are people ignoring this witness because it completely torpedoes their standpoint on it? Probably. Or is it one of them that they just haven't researched it well enough?
It could be sort of like, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really. And I think this is the thing as well, that, when you're looking into these accounts, it is a question of, am I actually looking at all of them? Am I filtering these out because they don't fit what I'm looking for? Or is it just the fact that someone hasn't come across this? Because I have this sometimes, because I like using British newspaper archives, and
yes.
You can scour the archives and go, I can't find anything on this one thing, but maybe those papers haven't been scanned yet. So there is always a possibility that you might go back in a year or two's time and then something else will crop up. So it's difficult to ever be completely definitive. I mean, sometimes you can be, because you're like, that happened in 18 whatever. It's unlikely someone's going to have found something new since then. But on the whole, you do sometimes have to go a bit like, ooh, maybe I haven't found all the sources, because you can't possibly find literally everything. But I think if there is quite an obvious source that people have overlooked, you do have to then wonder why. And this is where, again, I think the both and mindset comes in really handy when you're looking at ghosts or folklore or cryptids or whatever it might be, that something, rather than being either or, the both and is definitely more useful, because then that way you can have, because I find this sometimes with things where I can read it and go, that is absolute hogwash, but it's also really interesting because of this other thing. So it can be both nonsense and interesting at the same time. And I think, and it's a bit like, oh God, if I have to tell one more person that Ring of Roses isn't about the plague, because it doesn't, and I direct people in my podcast episode about it now, and a lot of people won't believe me, but they'll believe the bloke who wrote the article, who I then went off and looked at what he'd said. They'll believe him, but not me. Interesting. And because people have heard this for so long, it's that, again, it comes back to what I said before, people will not let go of beliefs that they've held for a long time, because humans don't want to admit they're wrong, because then that might mean ostracism from the social group, and that could be dangerous. I get it. But this is the thing with folklore, you can go, I used to believe that this rhyme from the 1880s was about the Black Death, even though Chaucer and Pepys and Shakespeare never mention it. I used to believe that. And now I know that is a piece of folklore about a nursery rhyme, and that's not actually true. I can know both of these things. I can hold both of these things in my head at the same time. Isn't life grand? And I think that's where you have to have that kind of slightly more expansive mindset of being able to hold contradictory things at the same time. Because in a lot of cases, it's like, well, sometimes you're not going to know one way or the other. Is something a hoax? Is it not? Sometimes it can be hard to tell, but then other times it can be something like that folklore where you're I know it's wrong, but I used to believe it. But I know James Wright, who's done some excellent debunking on building archaeology and building mythology and so on. One of the ones that gets his go is the myth of spiral staircases always turning in a particular direction to favour whoever was defending the castle. And it's nonsense. There's any number of examples where that's not the case, but people still confidently repeat it because they've been told it by someone who seems to know what they're talking about. You learn it and go, oh, that's disappointing. But now I get to know the myth and I get to know the truth at the same time. So I get sort of 2 for 1. And I think that kind of mindset definitely helps with all manner of folklore and ghosts and whatever else.
Absolutely. I can remember the day I discovered that daddy longlegsers were not the most venomous insect in the world. Icy, which is one of the first things I learnt on the internet, because I'd been told that as a kid growing up, and so I was convinced that the only reason we're not all dead is because their fangs just weren't strong enough to pierce human skin. And I believed that until I checked it on the internet, and it's absolute nonsense. So we have to adapt. You have to change. And that's what sets some people apart, is admitting you're wrong and moving forwards. But I'm the same with Ring of Roses. I remember meeting a prospective new boyfriend of my partner at the time's best friend, and he mentioned that, and I got really uppity and said, that's absolute nonsense. And my partner was just digging me in the ribs going, shut up, shut up, shut up. He's on a first date. Shut up, shut up. And I was like, I don't care. He's wrong. I don't give a shit. It's not true. And that was that. Eventually he believed me, but we got there in the end.
But I think this is the thing, there's absolutely no shame whatsoever in this day and age in admitting that you were wrong about something and going, I believe this, and now I have additional information, so now I know this instead. And I think the focus there is on the acquisition of new information, and if you put your focus on that, rather than whether you were wrong here or there, because it may well be that new information will come along, and then you've got to change your mind again. And that's how science works. That's why science at the time is always really, like, I don't want to say cutting edge, but you know what I mean? Like, science can only know what it knows right now. Yes. And then something new will come along and they'll be like, oh, now we know this new thing. And it doesn't mean the first thing was necessarily wrong. It just meant that was at the extent of what scientists knew at the time. Obviously, with folklore, it's a bit of a different ballgame, because it's not like I'm going to suddenly learn some new secret to neuroscience or something. Me coming about something against fairies isn't life or death. I mean, it could be if I wander into the wrong fairy ring, like. Yes. But then again, you look at everything that's going on and go, would that be the worst thing? Who knows?
Now is the time to be fairly led.
But I do think that it is just being open to updating. Now, that can obviously go the wrong way. And that can obviously then lead you down the wrong rabbit hole. And then thus, people then end up believing all kinds of stuff about 5G and things like that, which is obviously silly. So it goes both ways. But I do think that, being open to taking in information from different sources and not just always from the same place. And this is one of the things I see where a lot of people's favourite source at the moment seems to be ChatGPT. And it's like, no, because it makes stuff up. Or the AI overview comes out with some absolute howlers because it doesn't have the context. So, I mean, I saw one where it was trying to claim that one of the most haunted stretches of road in northeast England was between two castles, but there is no stretch of road between those two castles. And what it had done, and this is like Chillingham and Bamburgh, both fabulous places to visit, but it had taken the fact that there was supposed to be a haunted stretch of road near Woodhorn and near Ashington, which wouldn't surprise me because that's obviously colliery territory there. And it had taken that piece of information from that website and then slammed together haunted castles and gone, they must be... Well, no, because there's 30 miles between Woodhorn and Chillingham and Bamburgh, so no. But it was completely... You could see why, if you just read the it sounds right, but if you know the local area, or you actually read any of the articles that the AI overview sent you to, you'd be like, well, where is this stretch of haunted road? Because it doesn't actually appear in any of them, because it's just done an aggregate of what it's found. So I think... being open to evaluating your sources and having a range of trusted sources, obviously, I think is helpful. And I think that's where, because a lot of people, when they say now they've done their research, I'm always a little bit like, what did you use? And this might be because I teach students how to write dissertations, so I am a bit like, yeah, no, that's not no, you can't just quote some random TikTok video, I'm sorry. Unless you're looking for first-hand testimony about a thing, and so you're wondering how people, for example, use YouTube, then that would work as a source, but you can't use, no. So I think it's information literacy and recognising that just because a book maybe was published in like 1900 doesn't necessarily make it, or earlier, doesn't make it the text that you should base your thinking on. And I'm thinking here of something like the Golden Bough. There's being responsible for a lot of inaccuracies. So read widely around a topic, and see who's agreeing, who's disagreeing, And you don't have this problem quite so much, I think, with ghosts, because you can trace the development and the belief of it. And it's all fairly logical how they got from one step to another, and I think that's fine. But a lot of the witchcraft stuff, it's like, yeah, you do need to read beyond books that were written in the 70s or earlier. So just enjoy reading.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And having visited Chillingham in April, it could do with an easier stretch of road to get to. It's a right pain in the arse. If you blink, you'll miss the turning. I see.
Yeah, it is a very cool place to visit. Very odd when you discover that it's like Dominic Cummings' in-laws own it.
Yes.
My mum had a conversation with, I can't remember her name, but basically his Dominic Cummings' mother-in-law, because she just potters round in the garden. She's a perfectly lovely woman. And my mum had a conversation with her about the gardens. And so it was only when everything came out with like the Barnard Castle gate that it was like, oh my God, we've been to his in-laws.
Yeah, it was, and it's like I say, because we covered all those, and I've been to Bamburgh as well previously. You know, they're nowhere near each other. They could do with a nice stretch of road, but obviously Bamburgh's on the coast, Chillingham's quite inland, and you've got that road that splits basically on the way up to Lindisfarne. You turn off, and then you're in the right area, but there's no direct road there at all. Yeah,
so somehow, as I say, they picked that up from near Ashington, which is 30 miles south.
Maybe it's a ghost road.
Google. Well, this is it. Is there a road that you can only see on a full moon if you look at it from the right angle? Maybe. I don't know. That would be cool.
Yeah, maybe you've got to wipe your eyes with ivy, perhaps, Icy, on a certain time of year, and then it appears magically.
I bet that road's on Apple Maps, so it's not on Google Maps.
Well, the last set of characters I want to touch on is one of those wonderful things, as I say, I love when I learn something new. And this is the rather fearsome Santa Campana, who hang around the northern parts of Spain and Portugal. And what a fearsome bunch of strange things these sound to be. This sounds like the kind of thing, as you say in the introduction to this particular section. Yes, you may wish to sort of say hello to them, but it's probably the worst thing you can do is make them aware of your presence.
Yes. The name translates to Holy Company. And they're quite common across northwestern Iberia, so that's like Galicia, northern Portugal. And I can't hear like Portugal and Spain in the same sentence without thinking of that line from Over the Hills and Far Away, you know, the theme for Sharp. That always kind of, that shows how old I am, doesn't it? Anyway, that's where I discovered Sean Bean. And basically what they are is you have this procession of the dead that most people can't see. There's usually between 6 and 12, depends on where you are, because it does vary slightly. And what they're for also depends. So they're very, very local, so like different regions have their own Santa Campana.
Yeah.
In some cases, they're there to collect the soul of someone who's about to die, which very much makes them psychopomps, and I love a good psychopomp. And obviously, they go back into antiquity. Like, psychopomps are absolutely fascinating. And I find that a very comforting idea. And I think I said on one podcast that I always think of a psychopomp as being a bit like, if you imagine, like, dying and then entering the afterlife being a bit like getting to Charles de Gaulle Airport and you've no idea what's going on. And then there's a person there and they're holding up a sign with your name on it. And you know where you need, and they take you where you need to be, like the right arrival hall, because Charles de Gaulle is a really, really, really confusing airport. Psychopomps, that's what they're for. I love psychopomps. But anyway, so one version they collect whoever's about to die. Other places they're there as like death heralds, so they announce who's going to die in the coming year. As I say, it does vary. So that's quite an interesting thing, the way that people have sort of obviously put their own twist on it. When they walk abroad varies. Sometimes it's just whenever they're there to claim a soul, basically. Other times it's at Halloween or Midsummer's Eve, which is quite good for such things. That will be sort of, June the 23rd. But the thing that separates them from other sort of processions of the dead is the fact that they're led by a living person who's a local parishioner. And they're basically cursed to lead the procession every night. And they have no idea what's going on during the night. So they just like wake up probably knackered. And you're like, oh my God, is that why I'm always so tired on a morning? It's like, no, that's long COVID. But this would be almost a better explanation. So they can't remember what's happened during the night, but they've sort of almost in this trance led this procession. and they carry a cross. Sometimes it's holy water, depends again where they are. They're not allowed to look behind them, which has a little bit of shades of Orpheus going on there, which I think is quite an interesting little point. But they basically have to persuade someone to take over the job for them, so that they can then be released from the task. But if they don't, they generally sicken and die. But the problem is, because they can't remember when they wake up that they're doing it, how do they then persuade someone to take over from them? It's a really, really awful, like, double bind to be in, and it sounds like a really awkward situation. And so they basically need to be able to pass that on, ideally. The reason why I find them so fascinating, though, is because generally with psychopomps, and obviously I dealt with 2 of them in Rebel Folklore, and obviously you think of people like Hermes or Mercury or Anubis is a really popular one. They're not a danger to literally anyone else in the environs. So, you know, you could literally be on your deathbed and Thanatos turns up to get you, and anyone else who's there is just like totally unaware of what's happened. But with the Santa Campagna, it's like seeing them as a living person is actually really dangerous. So you can't see the procession, but you can see the parishioner. So I'd imagine if you saw someone walking along a path late at night carrying a cross, you'd probably be a bit like, ooh, this isn't for me. And although the descriptions still say what the dead look like, so I'm not quite sure how if the living can't see them, but we'll ignore that one. Apparently, if they're going through the forest, the animals will fall silent. So if it suddenly goes silent at night, it's like just turn away from the path, basically. So you go down that route of not looking at them is the best sort of route, as it were. So you can, if you carry a black cat, that will apparently ward them off. How the cat feels about this, I'm not sure. If they walk past you and hand you a cross, you will join them. So basically make sure your hands are full. Maybe that's why women's clothes don't have pockets, to keep your hands full.
Yeah.
Who knows? Alternatively, move away from the path, just get out of their way. You can avoid looking at them in whatever method suits you best. If you sort of lie face down and just refuse to look at them again, that's another way of doing it. You can also, in some places, they recommend that you do the hand gesture that metalers have been doing for years, which is like, you know, the horns gesture of like put your hand in a fist and put your first and little fingers up. That one sort of wards off the evil eye, so apparently it also wards them off as well. But basically, if you don't do any of those things, then you'll die within the year. So again, it's how did people record this? Did people say that they'd seen the Santa Campagna and then within a 12-month they died, and people then put 2 and 2 together? I'm not quite sure where that belief comes from, but then you sort of think, does it really matter? This has become associated with them. And I think in some ways it's a good way of getting people to avoid things like dark places and forests late at night, which would already be dangerous, not necessarily from other people, but just you could have obviously falls from height, depending on obviously how high up you are. You've obviously got wild animals. It's often a lot colder at night. So in some ways, it's one of those kind of stories that makes me think it's a cautionary tale to keep people away from specific spaces, because no one sees them during the day because they don't walk during the day. But you can see where you're going during the day.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, they really are just walking around in that area, in which case I hope I never come across them.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it seems quite unique as well, that you've got this procession of the dead. And you'll hear stories from around the world, like Hawaii's night walkers and the things like that are similar, but aren't really the same, because you've got this kind of cursed human element to it, which, like you say, is quite unique in the pantheon of strange encounters with the afterlife. Because, as you say, it seems to be one of those kinds of curses that seems to be more connected to folklore than the paranormal, because ghosts don't really come with a curse often. I know we've got a few older stories where, you know, somebody's died and it's this house is cursed, people whoever goes in there will die, whereas this seems to be, if you're unfortunate enough to fall under their gaze, that's it. And you only kind of come across that kind of thing in stories of the Fae, or perhaps, I mean, the Lugaru from the southern states of the US. Obviously, one of the weird werewolf differences that one has is, if you don't tell somebody that you're a werewolf, after 101 days, you can also pass it on to people if they see you change, which I don't think is fair on the person that sees you change. I don't think they're wandering around going, I hope I bump into a werewolf tonight.
Yeah. I think the thing I find quite fascinating with the Lugaroo is also you can kind of be cured of it as well, which is weird because it's the only kind of werewolfism thing that there seems to be a cure where you can then just live out the rest of your days. And I quite like that because it's almost got like a cheat code embedded in it, which is quite interesting. And I think in a way the Santa Campagna do as well. And I think a lot of the death-related ones, which I always find really interesting because in some cases... the living can't see the figures, but they can see the candles that they carry, which is a little bit like the corpse candles that you get in Welsh folklore. And people might go, ooh, a group of people gathering the souls of the dead, that sounds like the Wild Hunt. But the difference is the fact that the Wild Hunt's usually led by the likes of Odin, it might be Gwyn ap Nudd, depending on where you are. Sometimes it's Perchta, but either way, you don't have a living person from that area. So that will be a community member you would know as well. So the chances are, if you saw them walking on, maybe I don't wear my glasses all the time. So if I saw someone I thought I vaguely recognised, didn't cotton on that they were carrying a crucifix and then stop them for a chat, I'm knackered. You know what I mean? So it's like, this is the thing where there is almost like an element of risk attached to it as well. But it is the fact that you've got that living person at the front, which is what differentiates it. And that, for me, is what is a good reminder to, instead of going, oh, that's just their version of this story. No, it's their version of the Santa Campagna. And then other areas have their version of the Wild Hunt. And other versions of psychopomps. And while I know I said before, these psychopomps do these things, as a category in general, that's what they do. But there's still always differences according to their cultural context within that I think are really important because they tell you something about where the thing came from. But I do think it's always important to not try to go, oh, that's their version of this, because there can then be a tendency to assume that the original was, for example, Northern European, and then everything's just a remix of that, when actually they've just emerged at the same time because it was what humans were preoccupied with at that particular point in history. Really.
Absolutely. And Spain has a fascinating history in regards to its relationship with Catholicism.
Yes. And
some of the extremes it found itself in. Obviously, probably the most infamous of them was Torquemada and the Spanish Inquisition. Which is, 600-700 years ago, and we still know who they are and what they did and why they were doing it. That would be the only kind of thing you could perhaps prescribe a sort of origin of some description to it, that kind of persecution of non-believers or heretics, perhaps. But why would it only be specific to the northern regions of Iberia? That went on all across that area. So as soon as you start to look at the history of Spain and how it developed its Catholicism and its belief systems, very quickly you find out that potential explanation doesn't work. Because if that's the case, why are there not Santa Camparas all over the country? Why are they not leaking into the Pyrenees, into places like Andorra? Even, there are parts of France which are essentially as Spanish as you can be. They just happen to be in France. And it's, there's that border area along the Pyrenees. There's a lot of cross-cultural pollination from both sides. They're very rich. And as Andorrans will show, because they seem to be a perfect mix of French and Spanish that's kind of smack bang in the middle of them all. And so, like you say, often you'll see explanations mesh together, saying, oh, well, it sounds a bit like this, so it must be the same. It's like doppelgangers and Voyagers. People now constantly talk about Voyagers as doppelgangers. And it really annoys me because they're not the same thing. They're very different. They behave very differently. They just look like a person or the person. They're not how they behave and what they do and what the ramifications are not the same kind of thing. And yet nowadays, most people think they're the same thing, which is really frustrating. And like you say about the Wild Hunt and the Santa Campana, yes, they are similar, but once you dig into them, they're very different.
Yeah, and I think one of the things because I mentioned in Ghostlore about the fact that the one thing I can think of, and this is a tenuous link at best, is the fact that part of like Galicia and northern Portugal and so on would have been settled by the Celts.
Yes.
Because obviously everyone forgets that they went into the Iberian Peninsula. And so that you can see that there is a bit of a tenuous link between obviously a people who lived across sort of the Germanic parts of Europe, and then all the way down at that peninsula. However, I think it's really dangerous to look at things like that and go, oh, here's a through line, because there's this thing in the Iron Age, and here's this thing that sort of obviously has been recorded at some point in the last couple of centuries. It must be a survival of that, because you go, well, have you got any evidence of it in between? Because if not, then that doesn't make sense. And I think, again, so this is where it is really important to look at the differences and to go, well, why is it important that it's a living person that leads them rather than a god? And there's something really almost ordered and sober and, what's the word, mournful about the Santa Campagna compared to the Wild Hunt, whose name would suggest something a little bit more lively. And I think this, as I say, this can be a tendency to try to find equivalents of everything. And sometimes a thing just is what it is. And, you know, you can get someone like the Dullahan who literally only appears in Irish folklore, and that's fine. Madame Koi Koi only appears in particular types of schools in Nigeria, and that's fine. There doesn't need to be, you know, some kind of overarching story arc that ties them all together. Sometimes they just appear where they do. Other times you do get things like black dogs who are just everywhere and they're fairly ubiquitous. And white ladies, you can't really move without falling over one. But I personally am all right with that because I love white lady ghosts. So I do think it's important to look at them in terms of their cultural context. And also just to admire them and learn about them as what they are. And I think that it's the other thing that always fascinates me with the Santa Campagna is the fact that, yes, they're in northern Spain, but they're also into Portugal as well. And you sort of get... The minute that borders begin to melt is always really interesting because it just reminds you how much people move around or used to move around.
Yes.
And how what we consider a community or a region is obviously very different from what people... And that's what I love about the Santa Campagna, that people have different versions depending on which parish you're in. Like, in some cases, it depends who the parish's like patron saint is as to whether the parishioner is a man or a woman. So there's such a lovely like internal logic to a lot of it, that you think this is obviously grown out of this particular region for a reason, and then of course you can go, maybe they're real, and then you just leave it at that, and then you're like, maybe we just accept that this is a procession that happens, and it is what it is. And I think, to me, when you consider that there are pockets of weird creatures and birds and insects that only occur in particular places, you've got, don't even get me started on the weirdness of fungi and how it just does bizarre stuff, like the fungi in like Chernobyl's reactor 4 and stuff. Like, that's super specific. Why could ghosts and supernatural creatures not be the same?
Absolutely. I think there's enough differentials to mark them out as being separate entities without trying to sort of as with anything, stop trying to put everything in boxes, people. Yeah. You know, and
that's what I tried to do with the book. It's kind of like, because it cuts across so many broad ideas, it's like just read them, get to know them, be interested in them, and just go, I don't want to meet that one on a dark night. Yeah,
absolutely. Though I was considering my options. I've not been to the north of Spain for quite a while. Now I'm a bit more eager. Now I'm prepared, Icy. I'm prepared.
Well, it's not real if it's not on TikTok.
Damn it. Oh, well, I mean, we've only scratched the surface, as we said, that we've covered 3 of our particular favourites. There's another 47, and I challenge anybody to know all of them that doesn't own this book. It's a wonderful collection, another brilliant addition to your ongoing work. It's a fantastic companion to your Rebel folklore book that came out a couple of years ago as well, and I recommend it highly, regardless as a present or whatever. Whenever I see your name attached to anything, I get quite excited because I know it's going to be bloody good.
Oh, thank you.
So, where can everybody get a copy of this book, your previous work, listen to your marvellous podcast, The Fabulous Folklore Show, and learn more about weird things they perhaps don't even realise are folklore, amongst anything else you'd like to mention, my dear?
You can get Ghostlore and, of course, Rebel Folklore as well from all good bookshops, probably some others as well. I always like to recommend bookshop.org purely because I'm a big fan of independent bookshops, but find it wherever you want. I know when I was in Lincoln the other day, Ghostlore was actually in the window. And I was so chuffed. I'd never seen one of my books in an actual bookshop. I've seen it in Forbidden Planet in Newcastle, but I'd never seen one of my books in Waterstones, and that was like my thing. And I saw Ghostlore, and I went up to the guy on the till and I went, "You've got my book," and he let us sign them. So there was like 2 signed copies of Ghostlore in the shop with the signed by the author sticker on them.
It's a big Waterstones, that one in Lincoln as well. My daughter was at uni at Lincoln, so I know it quite well.
But yeah, so you can get those from independent bookshops, regular bookshops, and so on. Somebody sent us a message saying that they'd seen it in a bookshop in New South Wales the other day, because I love hearing where people see it. And I remember like someone had told us that they'd seen Rebel Folklore in Toronto, but I think New South Wales wins for the furthest away than anyone seen one of my books. And then obviously Fabulous Folklore you can find on, I think it's literally every platform. It is on YouTube as well if people want to watch the video versions, which are basically like an audio thing. So it's like there's very rarely visuals. I will say if there are visuals, anything, but it has captions. So if anyone wants subtitles or they want to know how to spell something, because obviously, let's be honest, some of these have got quite unusual names, then, or you just struggle with my accent, then obviously the captions are there. And then for my website, where all my gubbins are, it's just icysedgwick.com. And if you try and put an extra E in my surname, Google will correct you, so...
Good for Google.
Yeah.
Well, listen, it's been brilliant to speak to you again. I always feel enriched when I spend time in your company. I always learn something, Icy, as I do when I read any book you release. And I just want to say thank you very much for spending some time with me. And I will not leave it 4 years till the next time we speak on my show. So please forgive me. And my New Year's resolution will be to speak to you more regularly. And I thank you again for fitting me in. And the best of luck with Ghostlore.
It's my absolute pleasure.